So thank you very much for having me here this evening. Now, just as we begin, I'm going to start this timer going so that I can see how long I've done, because I'm a historian, and if you know any historians, you'll know that we are not always the most punctual of people. If you've ever been kept waiting by a historian that you've agreed to meet for lunch, you'll know that while we are completely at ease using vague phrases such as the long 18th century, we can really struggle with more precise concepts like 1:30. So I'm going to try really hard not to overrun. You would have thought that if I'm doing a PhD in history, I should at least not be surprised by the regular passing of time. So let's see if I can manage that. So my name is Kevin, and I'm a historian of science. And whenever I introduce myself as a historian of science, I'm aware that most people don't really know what that means. History of science isn't really a thing. In fact, just recently at Christmas, I was talking to someone about my research, and she said to me, I just don't understand for the life of me why you think that studying the history of science is valuable. Surely it's a complete waste of time looking at old theories if we now know that they're wrong. Why can't you just hurry up and give me some grandchildren like your brother has? So this evening, I'm going to answer the question, what's the point of doing history of science? And I'm going to answer it with just 2 facts. So here comes fact number 1. So this is a jellyfish. It's a particular type of jellyfish called a golden jellyfish. And the golden jellyfish lives in just one place, in one lake, in an island called Palau in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And this lake in Palau has got so many jellyfish in it, literally millions of jellyfish crammed into this one lake, that the scientists who study this lake have exerted their imaginations to the utmost limit of their capacities and decided to call this lake Jellyfish Lake. And the golden jellyfish in Jellyfish Lake can do something amazing. Because the lake is cut off from the sea, they have no source of food. So the jellyfish have evolved a symbiotic relationship with the algae in the lake, and they have absorbed the algae into their bodies, and they use the algae to get energy directly from the sun. The golden jellyfish in Jellyfish Lake can effectively photosynthesize. Amazing. Except, okay, now please don't get angry with me for what I'm about to say. I'm about to break the golden rule of science communication. I'm a bit worried this is going to get me thrown out of the Robin Ince fan club. I don't think this fact is particularly interesting. I secretly think it's quite boring. Because the jellyfish had to do that. The lake is cut off from the sea. They had no other source of food. All that they could do was evolve a symbiotic relationship with the algae. All the jellyfish that didn't evolve a symbiotic relationship with the algae are now dead. If they hadn't adapted, there wouldn't be any jellyfish left, there'd be nothing to study, and Jellyfish Lake would just be called Lake. If they'd done something extra, then that would be interesting. If they'd written and published some poetry articulating how they felt about the symbiotic relationship with the algae, then that would be interesting. If they'd held a referendum to decide whether or not they wanted to stay in the symbiotic relationship with the algae, and 52% of the jellyfish had voted to leave, even though there was no plan for what they were going to replace the algae with, they were obviously all going to die, then that would be interesting. But they didn't do that. They did the bare minimum they needed to continue to exist. What is more amazing is that we know about them. What is more amazing is that someone has gone to this one lake on the other side of the planet, convinced someone to pay them to sit and watch jellyfish all day, spotted a pattern, checked it, worked out the reasons for the pattern, communicated it to me so that I can tell it to you here in Manchester this evening, confident that you'll know what the word photosynthesize means. That is more amazing than this fact about jellyfish. That is the real miracle here. Because, and I'm about to blow your minds now with fact number 2, all humans are idiots. Now, you will know that this is true if you've ever met a human. If you've ever seen someone apologise after walking into a lamppost, if you've ever ordered anything online which has to be delivered by Yodel, or not expected. Or if you ever seen the film Fast and Furious 6, a film which it took more than 400 people to make, all of whom we can only assume were trying really hard not to make a terrible film? And yet somehow thousands and thousands of human idiots have worked together to produce this fact about jellyfish. How did that happen? Well, the world expert in golden jellyfish is this man, Professor Michael Dawson. And most of his funding comes from the American government. Now, why are the American government interested? Jellyfish Lake is not in America. Palau is an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Well, it turns out that the Americans essentially own Palau, because there was a big battle over it during the Second World War when they won it off the Japanese. And Japan had won it off Germany in the First World War, and before that it had been a trading post in the Spanish Empire. Palau is quite close to Guam, the main American military base in the Pacific. And studying the jellyfish is good for tourism, which is good for the economy, which helps maintain American control over the islands, which is good for the American military. Now, I don't want to overstate this link. I'm not trying to argue that the main purpose of the American military is to undertake research into marine biology. That famous scene at the start of Saving Private Ryan with the D-Day landings on Omaha Beach would have been very different if every 30 seconds Tom Hanks had bent down to pick up a cuttlefish. But it's definitely part of the story. So that was how the fact was made. How did that then get across to the other side of the planet back to me? Well, I came across it last Wednesday lunchtime when I was watching a video in my lunch break in the British Library in London, which is where I work. And this video being made by everybody's favourite TV presenter with glossy hair and a D in A-level maths, Brian Cox. So how did Brian Cox, who, I don't know if I just mentioned this, got a D in A-level maths, how did he become my main source of information about golden jellyfish? Well, there are lots of answers to that question, but one of them is that Brian Cox has a TV career because he used to be a pop star. He used to be in a band called D-Ream, and early in his career, it definitely made him more attractive to broadcasters that he was glamorous, that he'd been in this well-known band. Now, this is very peculiar. Why do I trust the former keyboard player from D-Ream to be a reliable source of knowledge about the natural world? Why have I entrusted this highly specialised and technical task to a pop star from the 1990s? That is weird. If you were buying a house, you wouldn't ask for the legal documentation to be processed by Westlife. You wouldn't take pensions advice from Keith out of The Prodigy. Okay, sorry, I realise that I'm quite a bit older than many of you. I might need to explain some of the references in that sentence. So Westlife and The Prodigy, they were bands in the 1990s. Buying a house is a thing that people used to do in the 20th century. And a pension it's too complicated. Ask your parents. But there's, of course, a very good reason why we trust Brian Cox, and that's because he's a professor at a prestigious institution, one that many of you may well be part of, the University of Manchester. And this is where we need to start having some difficult conversations, because the prestige and the status of the University of Manchester derive ultimately from its wealth. And where did that wealth originally come from? Well, the men like John Owens, who founded this university in the 19th century, made their money from the cotton industry. And that means capitalism, that means empire, that means slavery. And clearly it's not just the University of Manchester. Every academic and scientific institution in this country owes a large chunk of its wealth to capitalism, to empire, to slavery, including the one that I work at, the British Library, founded in 1753 in part from the profits of slavery. And while we're having difficult conversations, where are the women in my story? I've only mentioned 2 scientists so far, and they've both been men. Well, that's because science is expensive. It can only be done by people who have money and who have power. And historically, the people who have money and power have all been men. And by the way, I'm not trying to argue that Brian Cox is responsible for the patriarchy, but he is definitely someone who has benefited from its existence, as indeed have I. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that for me as a white man, doing history of science is the most efficient way I've discovered to turn my favourite subject, which is science, into my favourite emotion, which is guilt. And And this is why we do history of science. There are loads of interesting stories here. All of this stuff is much more interesting than jellyfish. This is way more interesting than jellyfish. This pisses all over jellyfish, which, as anyone who's been stung by one will know, is exactly the thing they least want you to do to them. So if you want to find out more, please do come and say hello at the bar afterwards, or if you're ever passing, pop into the British Library. I'm very easy to find. Just go in at the main entrance, turn left, and follow the sound of someone repeatedly banging their head against a desk. Thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of the evening.